Next, let's look at the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland lies anterior to the trachea and just inferior to the thyroid cartilage, which forms the most anterior surface of the larynx. The two lobes of the thyroid gland are united by a slender connection called the isthmus. An extensive blood supply gives the thyroid a deep red color. The thyroid gland contains numerous thyroid follicles, spheres that are lined by simple cuboidal epithelium. Each follicle contains a viscous colloid. The viscous colloid contains a large number of suspended proteins and thyroid hormones. Follicular cells make thyroid hormones that are then stored in the colloid. Under thyroid-stimulating hormone stimulation from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, the epithelial cells remove the hormones from the follicular cavities and release them into the bloodstream. The thyroid hormones are derived from molecules of the amino acid tyrosine, to which iodine atoms have been attached, creating thyroxine, or T4, which is a tetraiodothyronine, which has 4 atoms of iodine, or triiodothyronine, which is T3, and has 3 iodines, and is more potent. Thyroid hormones affect almost every cell in the body. Inside the cell, they bind to receptor sites on mitochondria and in the nucleus. In the mitochondria, the rate of ATP production is increased. Thyroid hormone receptor complexes in the nucleus activate genes coding for the synthesis of enzymes involved in glycolysis and energy production, resulting in an increased rate of metabolism and oxygen consumption in the cell. Normal production of thyroid hormones establishes a background rate of cellular metabolism. The C cells of the thyroid gland are also called parafollicular cells and are found between follicles. They produce calcitonin. Calcitonin is stimulated by an increase in plasma calcium ions. Calcitonin has been shown to inhibit osteoclasts in the bone and stimulate calcium excretion by kidneys. Calcitonin is essential for normal bone growth in children and especially important in the last trimester of pregnancies. The parathyroid glands are paired, small glands embedded on the posterior surface of the thyroid. Chief cells in the parathyroid glands produce parathyroid hormone, or PTH. Parathyroid hormone is stimulated by a decrease in plasma calcium ion concentrations and has been shown to activate osteoclasts in the bone. Parathyroid hormone also reduces the calcium excretion by the kidneys and stimulates the kidneys to secrete calcitriol. Calcitriol has been shown to increase calcium ion absorption in the digestive tract. This is a good time to pause the recording and test your knowledge. The adrenal gland is also called the suprarenal gland. It is a yellow, pyramid-shaped gland that sits on the superior border of each kidney. The suprarenal or the adrenal gland has 2 portions, the outermost adrenal cortex and the inner part, which is the adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex contains high levels of cholesterol and fatty acids, and that's why the gland looks kind of yellowish in color. The adrenal cortex produces more than 24 steroid hormones that are collectively called corticosteroids. In the bloodstream, these hormones are bound to transport proteins. Corticosteroids in general are vital to metabolism. The adrenal cortex has 3 distinct zones that synthesize specific corticosteroids. Mineralocorticoids are produced by the outer zone and affect electrolyte balance in body fluids. Aldosterone is a major mineralocorticoid, and it's secreted in response to low plasma sodium ions, low blood pressure, high plasma potassium ions, or the presence of angiotensin II. Aldosterone triggers the reabsorption of sodium ions in the kidney, sweat glands, salivary glands, and pancreas. Secondarily, it triggers water reabsorption through osmosis. The adrenal cortex also produces glucocorticoids, and these are produced mostly by the middle zone of the adrenal cortex and affect glucose metabolism. The most important glucocorticoids are cortisol, corticosterone, and cortisone. These are secreted in response to adrenocorticotropic hormone, and they increase rates of glycolysis and glycogenesis, resulting in an increase in blood glucose levels. They can also act as anti-inflammatories. Last, androgens are produced by the inner zone in both males and females. Some are converted to estrogens in plasma, but in normal, small amounts, do not affect sexual characteristics. Their functions remain somewhat unclear. The adrenal medulla is pale gray or pink due to the many blood vessels within it. It contains large, rounded cells similar to those found in other sympathetic ganglia, and these cells are innervated by preganglionic sympathetic fibers. Therefore, the secretory activities of the adrenal medulla are controlled by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. The adrenal medulla contains 2 populations of secretory cells. One produces epinephrine and the other produces norepinephrine. Both are continuously released at a low rate, but sympathetic stimulation accelerates the rate of discharge dramatically. Receptors for these hormones are found on skeletal muscles, adipocytes, liver cells, and cardiac muscle fibers. These hormones trigger mobilization of energy reserves from fat, glycogen, and results in increased availability of glucose. More glucose means more ATP for increased muscular power, endurance, rate, and force. Another important endocrine organ is the pineal gland, which lies in the posterior portion of the roof of the third ventricle in the brain. It contains neurons, glial cells, and secretory cells that synthesize hormone melatonin. Branches of the visual pathway enter the pineal gland and affect the rate of melatonin production. Several functions have been suggested for melatonin in humans. In some mammals, melatonin slows the maturation of sperm, ova, and reproductive organs. The role in human sexual maturation is unclear. It may protect the central nervous system with antioxidant activity by breaking down free radicals or highly reactive atoms like nitric oxide or hydrogen peroxide. The pineal gland may be involved in maintaining basic circadian rhythms. Next, the pancreas. The pancreas lies between the stomach and the proximal small intestine. It contains both exocrine and endocrine cells. Its major exocrine function is to make digestive enzymes, and we'll discuss that more in Chapter 16. About 1% of the pancreas has endocrine cells located in pancreatic islets also called the isolates of Langerhans, and they contain alpha cells that secrete the hormone glucagon and beta cells that secrete the hormone insulin. Glucagon and insulin regulate blood glucose concentrations. Now, glucose is the preferred energy source for most cells in the body, and it's the only thing that neurons run on. When blood glucose levels rise, like after a meal, beta cells in the pancreas release insulin. The insulin stimulates cells in the body to take up glucose out of the blood. This glucose is used to make ATP, build proteins, and increase energy reserves in the form of glycogen and fat. When blood glucose levels fall, like between meals, alpha cells release the glucagon. This tells the body cells to withdraw their glucose transporters from their cell membranes and begin to start running off their energy reserves, mainly to stop using the blood glucose. Adipocytes will respond by breaking down their triglyceride reserves. Skeletal muscles and liver cells will begin to break down their glycogen reserves. And from this glycogen, the liver releases glucose into the bloodstream. This is for neural cells to use. They need a constant, steady supply. This regulation of blood glucose level by the alpha and the beta cells of the pancreas occurs independent of direct neural stimulus. However, the isolate cells are indirectly affected by the autonomic nervous system activity and any hormone that also influences blood glucose level. For example, cortisol and thyroid hormones release will shift the blood glucose levels and ultimately lead to a response from the endocrine cells of the pancreas. This is a good place to test your knowledge so far on the topics we covered on the endocrine. In addition to the pancreas, many other organs that are part of other body systems have secondary endocrine functions, such as the intestines, which primarily process and absorb nutrients, but they also secrete local hormones that coordinate digestive activities, although the pace can be influenced by the autonomic nervous system. The primary function of the kidneys is to filter waste from the blood, but they also maintain electrolyte balance, blood volume, and monitor blood oxygen levels. Electrolytes are controlled with the secretion of calcitriol, remember that's derived from vitamin D, in response to the parathyroid hormone. Calcitriol stimulates the absorption of calcium and phosphate ions from the digestive tract. Erythropoietin is released by the kidneys in response to low oxygen levels in kidney tissues. This hormone stimulates the production of red blood cells by bone marrow, and increases in the number of red blood cells means an increase in the amount of oxygen transported by the blood. Renin is released by specialized kidney cells in response to a decline in blood volume, blood pressure, or both. Renin starts an enzymatic reaction that leads to the formation of angiotensin II. Angiotensin II stimulates the secretion of aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone that will restrict the loss of salt and water by the kidneys, stimulate thirst, and elevate blood pressure. Endocrine cells in the right atrium of the heart respond to increased blood volume entering the chamber. Excessive stress and stretch causes them to release atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, which promotes the loss of sodium and therefore water. Atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, also inhibits renin release, which will result in a decrease in blood pressure and blood volume. The thymus is located deep to the sternum in the mediastinum and is very active in early childhood, but atrophies in adults. The thymus secretes thymosins, which aid in the development and the maintenance of immune cells, specifically T cells. In males, interstitial cells produce androgens. The most important is testosterone, which promotes sperm production, maintains secretory glands of the reproductive tract, and determines secondary sex characteristics. It stimulates protein synthesis, among other functions. Nurse cells support the formation of functional sperm, and under follicle-stimulating hormone stimulation, these cells secrete the hormone inhibin, which plays a role in negative feedback to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. In females, sex cells called ova develop into follicles in response to follicle-stimulating hormone. Follicle cells surrounding the ova produce estrogens to support the maturation of the egg and stimulate the growth of the lining of the uterus. Follicles secrete inhibin as negative feedback to the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland as well. After ovulation, follicle cells reorganize into the corpus luteum, which release estrogens and progesterones to prepare the uterus for the arrival of the developing embryo. During pregnancy, the placenta functions as an endocrine organ to promote normal fetal development and delivery. Adipose tissue is a type of loose connective tissue that absorbs glucose and lipids from food to synthesize triglycerides for storage. As it does so, it synthesizes a hormone called leptin. Leptin binds to neurons in the hypothalamus involved with emotion and appetite control. The result is a sensation of fullness, satiation, and the suppression of appetite. Leptin must be present for normal gonadotropin-releasing hormone and gonadotropin synthesis. Low body fat can result in late puberty and cessation of menstrual cycles. An increase in body fat can increase fertility. Even though hormones are usually studied individually, extracellular fluids contain a mixture of hormones whose concentrations change daily and even hourly. When a cell receives instructions from two different hormones at the same time, there are 4 possible outcomes. The two hormones can have an antagonistic effect, which means that there's opposing responses. It could have a synergistic effect, where the net result of the two hormones is greater than the sum of their individual effects, like they're working together. Permissive effects is another type of hormonal interaction, where one hormone must be present in order for another hormone to work. Last, integrative effects is going to be a coordination of diverse activities among multiple hormones. The next few sections discuss how hormones interact to control normal growth, reactions to stress, and alterations of behavior and the effects of aging. Normal growth requires the cooperation of several endocrine organs, but the following 6 are especially important. Growth hormones' effect on protein synthesis and cellular development are most apparent in children. Growth hormone supports their muscular and skeletal development. In adults, its main role is to help maintain normal blood glucose levels and mobilize lipid reserves. Thyroid hormones are also required for normal growth, especially of the nervous system in infants, and the skeletal system in prepubescence. Insulin is required for growing cells to obtain adequate supply of energy and nutrients. Parathyroid hormone and calcitriol promote the absorption of calcium, which is essential for building bones. And reproductive hormones like androgens and estrogens act upon multiple cell populations, which accounts for differences in skeletal proportions, such as the broad hip bones in women, and the secondary sex characteristics, like an enlarged thyroid cartilage in men. Any condition that threatens homeostasis is a form of stress. Stresses may be physical, such as an illness or injury. They could be emotional, such as depression or anxiety. Or stresses could be environmental, such as extreme heat or cold. Stresses could also be metabolic, such as acute starvation. Many stresses can be opposed by homeostatic adjustments. For example, a decline in body temperature induces shivering and a change in a pattern of blood flow, which both act to restore normal body temperature. In addition, the body has general responses to stress that can occur, while other, more specific responses are underway. All stress-causing factors produce the same basic pattern of hormonal and physiological adjustments. These responses are part of the General Adaptation System, GAS, which has three phases: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. The alarm phase is sometimes referred to as the fight or flight phase. This is an immediate response to stress or crisis, and the dominant hormone is epinephrine. Its secretion is a part of a generalized sympathetic activation, which will result in increased mental alertness. It increases energy use by all cells, mobilizes glycogen and lipid reserves, changes circulation, and reduces digestive activity and urine production, while increasing sweat gland secretion and increasing heart and respiratory rates. The resistance phase begins if stress lasts longer than just a few hours. Glucocorticoids are usually the dominant hormone in this resistance phase, and others act to shift tissue metabolism away from glucose and thus increase the availability for neural tissues. The result is to mobilize the remaining energy reserves. Lipids are typically reduced by the adipose tissue, and amino acids are released by skeletal muscles. The goal here is again to conserve glucose, and peripheral tissues, except for neural tissues, are going to be breaking down their reserves like lipids to obtain their energy. In order to maintain and even elevate the blood glucose concentrations, the liver is going to synthesize glucose from other carbohydrates like glycogen and amino acids and lipids. To maintain blood volume, salts and water and other electrolytes will be conserved. Now, if the resistance phase goes on past what the body's lipid reserves are sufficient to maintain, the homeostatic regulation will eventually break down, and that's when the exhaustion phase begins. Without outside immediate corrective actions, organ systems will begin to fail, and this phase can prove to be fatal. With the exhaustion phase comes the collapse of vital systems. The lipid reserves have all been spent. There's been enough damage to vital organs that they are no longer structurally sound. The body is no longer able to produce glucocorticoids, and electrolytes can no longer be balanced. The last section of this lecture looks at hormones, behavior, and aging. The hypothalamus regulates many endocrine functions, and its neurons monitor the levels of many circulating hormones. Other portions of the brain that affect how we act are also sensitive to hormonal stimulation. This is probably more obvious in teenagers whose systems are recently awash in reproductive hormones, but also in adults. Hormones or an imbalance in hormones can lead to impairment of the central nervous system and its intellectual functions like learning and memory. The endocrine system undergoes relatively few functional changes with age, with the exception of the most dramatic in the decline in the concentration of reproductive hormones. Although the circulation of hormone levels may remain within normal limits, some endocrine tissues become less responsive to that stimulation. And that concludes the lecture on Chapter 10.